presentation from DG Clima and DG Agriculture or Agri. We have 3 speakers in the lineup. So Valeria Forlan is our first speaker, and Valeria is at DG Clima, and her area of expertise is the interplay between climate policies and agriculture and food sectors. The second speaker will be Nicola De Virgilio from DG Agriculture or DG Agri. And Nicola is area of expertise is policy analyst and research experience on climate change mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. And then our third speaker in this presentation will be Leonard Matthias Meyer from DG Agri as well. And Leonard is a policy officer focusing on climate and soil issues. So Nicola or Valeria is going to kick off, and the title of the presentation is How Carbon Farming Fits into Current Political Agenda Around Climate and Agriculture. So over to you, Valeria.
Thank you, David. I hope you can hear me fine.
Yes, perfect.
So yes. Okay, so yes, I will start with an overview of recent policy developments around the carbon farming. So Nicola, if you can put the next slide. Yeah, so the context where we are now is that we have a target to reduce the EU emissions in 2030 by 55% compared to 1990. This is an increased level of ambition with respect to our previous commitment from 2016. Now, with the new Commission and within the context of the European Green Deal, the European Union decided to increase this ambition. And this is coherent with a pathway that will lead us to climate neutrality in 2050. So this objective, which is enshrined in the climate law, is that in 2050, the European Union will have a balance between emissions and removals. Emissions will have decreased drastically, as you can see in this graph, but some emissions will still be there. And to balance these emissions, we will need to significantly increase carbon removals. And if in this graph you look at the greenhouse gas profile of the European Union in 2050, you see that above the zero line, so where we look at emissions, a big part is taken by agriculture, so the green segment. This is because some non-CO2 emissions in agriculture, such as methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, are very difficult to abate and will likely remain. But then the land sector also has a very positive role to play, because if you look at below the zero line, you have the dashed green line, which is carbon removals in the land sector. And there you also see that the land sector is one of the main contributors to this balancing of emissions. So all in all, the land sector with these emissions removals will make up for a big part of the greenhouse gas profile in 2050. And therefore we need really effective policies to address this sector going forward. So the next slide, please. So in this context, the Commission published last year in December a communication titled Sustainable Carbon Cycles. Of course, the priority must remain to drastically reduce emissions. So when we talk about carbon, we must drastically reduce the use of fossil carbon. But at the same time, we also need to increase carbon removals. And also because we will always need carbon for some materials, for some industrial applications, we should also get better at recycling and reusing the carbon that is already in the economy. So the communication look at these 3 aspects, not only within the land sector, but also the communication also looks at industrial technologies to remove carbon, such as carbon capture and storage. But here today, I want to focus more on carbon farming. So the next slide, please. Okay, carbon farming, I don't need to convince this audience about the benefits of carbon farming. We define it as a green business model. So it's really about a system of incentives to reward land managers that improve their management of the land when this results in carbon sequestration. These also include reducing the release of carbon to the atmosphere. And this is beneficial to the farmer because it brings an additional type of business, an additional income. It's of course beneficial for the climate because, as I said, we need carbon removals, but it can also have benefits for biodiversity, nature, and climate resilience. So also for food security in the long term. And then in the next slide, there are some examples of carbon farming applications, but these were already covered by the previous speaker very well. I just want to note that in the communication, we included in the scope of carbon farming also blue carbon, so carbon sequestration in coastal wetlands, and also through regenerative agriculture, aquaculture, sorry, and marine permaculture. These areas are still in development. We need some research yet to quantify, understand the carbon sequestration effects, but it has a lot of potential for the future. And then in the next slide. Okay, so the communication in itself is a policy paper, a roadmap that through which the Commission takes a position on this topic. So it's not a legislative instrument, but still it is important to set the tone of what we want to do in the next years. We set out two goals or challenges. The first is that by 2028, every land manager should have access to verified emissions and removal data. So every land manager should be able to assess, quantify its climate performance. And 2028 is not a random date. It's also the beginning of the next Common Agricultural Policy. And if we want to have a truly result-based Common Agricultural Policy when it comes to climate, we need better data at the parcel level. And we see a lot of developments also with the projects that was presented now, and many of you are probably working on very interesting and similar projects. We see a lot of developments also in terms of the application for remote sensing to support the monitoring and reporting of carbon sequestration. So we believe that by 2028, this is definitely a feasible goal. We also have a legislative instrument, the Regulation on the Land Use Change and Forestry, LULUCF. And there we just proposed last year to increase the target to 310 million tons of removals in 2030, and carbon farming applications should contribute to this target. And then we have an action plan in this communication, and some of these actions include creating an expert group that will advise the Commission in the development of any policy around carbon farming and carbon removals. And for that, the call will be published very soon, in 2 weeks' time. So I encourage all of you to, I guess the easiest way is to follow the social media of DG Climate, because there we will post the link to the call for experts. And through EU funding, so through this Common Agricultural Policy, mainly we will continue to support carbon farming. And Nicola will explain this just after me. And through Horizon Europe, and in particular the Soil Mission, we will continue. The Commission will continue to support relevant projects. And on that, my colleague Leonard will explain a bit more what opportunities exist. But I also want to anticipate that it's very important for us, this recent Soil Mission call, with a call for creating a network on carbon farming. Leonard will tell more about it, but it's a very, very relevant way for experts to contribute to this line of work. And then other actions, including a study on how to apply the polluter pays principle to agricultural emissions, which will start after summer. So within besides these actions specifically for carbon farming, we also have now, in the next slide, our main current work is to design a regulatory framework for the certification of carbon removals. this is not only about carbon farming, but it's also about industrial carbon removals, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture and storage, or also storage of biomass, storage of carbon in products that are used for construction, for instance. So we are working on a system to certify carbon removals in accordance with robust criteria, because the point is to allow all users of carbon removal certificates, whatever the use of the certificate is, to identify high quality carbon removals. And this means carbon removals that are quantified in an accurate way, which are additional to the business as usual baseline, which ensure sequestration for the long term, so for periods that are relevant to climate change mitigation, which provide environmental benefits, or at least do not harm environmental objectives, and which are certified in a transparent way. So which are verified by third-party audit, and which are registered in an open registry. And for this, we also need to set up a reliable governance framework, and to take into account that carbon farming solutions are very different. Industrial carbon removals are very different, and so the rules must be tailored to each specific application. So the proposal for this framework will be published at the end of this year. And yes, there was already an open public consultation which closed a month ago. So we are now considering this input from stakeholders in our work. So now I leave the floor to Nicola, who will talk more about the role of the CAP to support carbon farming.
Thank you very much, Valeria. I think, hope you can hear me as well. I would like to take now it more from the perspective of land manager and farmers, of course. And you see that already in the carbon farming initiative communication, there might be several barriers for farmers, and some of those has been also mentioned by Felix in the previous presentation. These barriers can be financial barriers. For example, when a farmer is moving to a new way to manage his own parcel, there might be new additional costs. But then also when we look at the possibility for farmers to sell credits, because of this is still a volatile market, and there are no very precise rules. There's also uncertainty about that. This can create barriers for farmers to uptake and go to carbon farming management of its parcel of land. There is a lot of uncertainty linked with the fact that there are a lot of standards now available, which can create confusions and trust in the reliability. This is also a reason why we start the work with the preparation of the certification of carbon credits just presented by Valeria. And then, as also mentioned already, there is the need to ensure environmental integrity also at farm level, additionality and permanence, and the big work that needs to be done on the monitoring, verification, and reporting that for carbon is still quite an important piece of building blocks that is missing in terms of reliable data and in terms of costs. The high costs to have a reliable estimation at parcel level are very big. It is also another important barriers for farmers. And then the need to have really tailored and training and advisory services, which are linked with the fact that we need to have an optimal, construct an optimal strategy in carbon sequestration practically for each farmers in Europe, in order to reflect pedological, climatic, social, and infrastructural different context. Some of these different examples on how to implement on how carbon farming has been implemented in Europe and also outside Europe is listed in this technical handbook that DG Clima produced a few years ago, where there can be inspirational for starting piloting carbon farming in EU. But I think that a big help can also come in solving some of these barriers from the common agriculture policy. I will tell you a little bit more about that. In the new common agriculture policy, you see there are three main objectives. One objective is really focusing on environment and climate. A specific objective within the more overarching objective is really mentioning climate mitigation and adaptation, and also, of course, financing carbon sequestration, clearly mentioned there, together with sustainable energy, production of renewable energy as well. This means that for member states, that they will have to analyze in a SWOT analysis what is this current situation, the situation in their member states on this topic, so including the sequestration of carbon. And this means that there are specific indicators in the policy framework, impact indicators on increase of organic carbon, but also on reduction of emissions, and the result indicator or the share of land, mostly where practices for beneficial for carbon are implemented at member state level. And that also means, for example, the fact that there is a dedicated, there's the possibility for member states to have a dedicated budget for that. Sometimes is a minimum ring fencing, for example, 35% in the second pillar, money for supporting activity on carbon farming. So there are tools in terms of principle in the CAP for helping carbon farming. I think that already looking at the good agriculture and environmental conditions obligations, which are basically requirement for land manager to fulfill in order to receive direct payment on hectare based, there are several GAEC which are beneficial for carbon. You see with the, for example, objectives which are more strictly linked with the protection of carbon, preserving carbon stock, protection of carbon-rich soils, also maintaining also organic matter. For example, with the GAECs against the erosion of soil. This is already there, and it's a bit linking with what Felix was saying about the role of the public policy in helping in protecting carbon in carbon-rich soils. Of course, then a lot of practices for increasing carbon can also be supported by this new tool, which is called Eco Scheme, which is voluntary for farmers and compulsory for member states to create them, to propose them, which can be used to support the implementation at based on hectare of practices, for example, cover crops beyond the conditionality, agroforestry for increasing carbon to the soil. And then, of course, we still have rural development measures as in the current CAP, which are agro-environmental measures with commitments which are for multi-years commitment on the implementation of good practices. I just also want to mention the fact that CAP can also be used for reducing what we mentioned about the cost of monitoring, reporting, and verification. Several interventions in the rural development plan can be used, for example, to support soil sampling at farm level, to support the use of tools for helping farmers in assessing their carbon balance and holding level and the parcel level, and the possibility to create together with farmers small project within the European partnership on agri and the operational groups which are supported by the measures of the rural development plan. And then, of course, the new agricultural knowledge information systems, what is AKIS, that member states will have to build, also will give the possibility to have more tailored advisory at farm level for each of the farmers in Europe for a better implementation of good strategies, and also to remember all the supports that comes for the training, the knowledge exchange, collective and cooperative approaches that are very important. For example, mainly when we are in area with a lot of small farmers, to go together and to implement together practices which are beneficial for carbon sequestration. I was also thinking, for example, on specific area where there is where peatlands is the main soil there. So when starting with the rewetting activities, a cooperation approach there is important. Also, for example, to buy new machineries for switching to conventional agriculture, to zero tillage agriculture, for example. There are other public funding opportunity, for example, the LIFE project and there are also new projects on better monitoring tools, cohesion policies, for example, can also help on that, and state aids at member states level that have an important element on agro-environmental climate commitment aspect. Just in a nutshell, to recall, I think that before going more to the research and innovation part, so that's carbon farming for us is a way to help reaching the climate neutrality in Europe. It can be win-win solutions for climate, biodiversity, and bioeconomy. There are several practices which are has several beneficial effects also on other environmental aspects, and also on bioeconomy, with the possibility for farmers to build new supply chains which are linked with the bio-based product development. We said it's an opportunity for farmers for income diversification, and a possibility for mobilize public funds, as you said already. And then an opportunity for improve the way we monitor carbon at parcel level. I think now we'll give the floor to Leonard, which basically will give more on the research and innovation part, which are linked on carbon farming. Thank you, Leonard. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Nicola. I hope you hear me all right.
Yes, thank you.
So what I wanted to do here very briefly is to elaborate a little bit on what Valeria already mentioned in terms of both projects that have recently been selected under our research and innovation framework program, which is Horizon Europe, of course, as you know, for the current period, and also highlight some of the upcoming opportunities. Of course, there are relevant projects also already funded under Horizon 2020, the previous research and innovation framework program. I'm not going to speak about those, mostly because I have been on this job only a few months, and I would not be very well placed to say much about what has happened until now, but I just wanted to start with this caveat. So in the work program from last year, there is a project that many of you will be familiar with, ORCASA, which is has recently taken off, let's say, and which follows up on a similar project that ran under Horizon 2020 called CIRCASA. And both of them are about the creation and operationalization of an international research consortium on fully focused on soil carbon. And this is coordinated by the French National Research Institute on Agriculture and Environment. We also have selected a project which is meant to be the first stage in let's say, layered development of a network of different groups of actors. that are involved in climate relevant activities in agriculture. And this is called Climate Farm Demo. It's not officially launched yet, but will start officially in the fall. Then perhaps more interesting for at least some of you here in this meeting, among the calls that are currently open in the 22 work program, there is this network and carbon farming that Valeria also already mentioned. This is in the soil mission work program. It's a so-called coordination and support action. Not a huge project, but that's also because we're not asking for any original research to be done in that context. It's really all about networking different groups of actors, researchers, as well as land managers and others, such as let's say technology providers. So there we're hoping, of course, for good and pertinent applications. The same applies then to the other two topics that I have listed here. One which is on MRV, which my colleagues have also already identified as an area needing additional work in the context of policy development. This is a research and innovation action. And then we also have in the current call the second layer of this demo network that I mentioned on climate smart farming, where the topic is now focused on advisory services. So we have the pilot farms in the first step, and advisory services now being added. Yeah, and then, of course, we're not supposed to speak about programs that are still in the making, but I think it's safe to say that in the work program for 23 and 24, relevant topics will also be included. Then if you can go to the next slide, please, Nicole. I wanted to at least mention briefly here two initiatives where from the EU and the member states we are cooperating with countries and organizations in other parts of the world on relevant R&I activities. The more long running of these initiatives is the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, or GRA, which has been running for more than 10 years already and has been doing a lot of very hands-on, regionally specific, but also often cross-regional work among the member countries. The Commission here is only, you might say, a partner, but many of the, or at least quite a few member states are very actively involved, including by leading some of the so-called flagship projects. And then a bit more recent, but also probably familiar to many of you, is the Aim for Climate that was launched at last year's Climate COP by the United States and the United Arab Emirates. Mainly focusing on the mobilization of additional R&I funding, the 4 billion that were announced at COP26 are supposed to be increased further. I think this is something that we can expect for COP27, that Aim for Climate will raise the bar in this respect. Here, the Commission is a full government partner, as are some of the EU member states. And in operational terms, perhaps most interesting there is the so-called innovation sprints that have been launched, I think 8 or 9 by now, focusing on various areas where there is some, where work is really advanced to the point that it can be relatively quickly be brought close to the market. And more of these are also in the pipeline in the context of Aim for Climate. So that's all really I want to say in terms of R&I. We have another slide, I think, with some of the links that people might want to look up in following up on our presentation. And with thanks to my colleagues, Valeria and Nicola, this closes our presentation. Back to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Thank you very much to Valerio, Nicola, and Leonard. We heard some, we got some insights, I suppose, to the carbon farming initiatives, the targets and the challenges. We got an update in terms of how this will interact with the Common Agricultural Policy, and then also in terms of the research and innovation that the Commission and others are funding going forward. So to get into some questions, there's very many questions, so we have about 15 minutes and we'll try to get through as many as possible. If I start with you, Valeria, a couple of questions from Sebastian and Sarah regarding the expert group. The first question is, when will the expert group start to meet, and what will be their precise role? And the second question is, will member state authorities be invited for this expert group?
Yes, so the call will be published in a couple of weeks, and yes, member states will be invited to appoint an expert through the permanent representation to the EU. But then it's not only member state representatives that will form the group, but also experts from academia, from industrial associations, NGOs. There are several types of experts, but yes, member state experts will be included. Hopefully, if we manage it swiftly, the first meeting will be after summer, September or October. And the role really very much depends on what the certification proposal will look like in December, because it depends to what extent this expert group will be actually defining the certification methodologies or working more on implementation of existing methodologies. So that I can't say exactly now. For sure, whatever rules we set in the proposal, the expert group will be there to help us implement them. And I wanted to mention that the expert group probably cannot cover all types of carbon removers, because remember, we're talking about carbon farming, but also industrial solutions. And even within carbon farming, you have so many different applications. So I really want to stress that in parallel, this network for carbon farming that Leonard talked about can really be there for the most specific certification methodologies for carbon farming. So please also consider, if you want to contribute to the work at the EU level to certify carbon removals, please also consider the soil emission calls. Okay.
So just finally then, in terms of member state authorities, can they join this group, or what is the situation there?
Yeah, in Commission expert groups, there are different types of members, and one type of members is a representative for member states. So we will invite every member state to appoint one expert. Okay. But it's still, the call is not even public yet. So yeah, it will be done this summer.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. A couple of questions coming in here on, I suppose, where carbon farming incorporates LULUCF. So the first question from Claire Genou is, to my understanding, carbon farming is reducing greenhouse gas emissions at farm scale, so is not restricted to carbon, but also concerns N2O emissions, reductions, etc. Could you please clarify, and you know, the LULUCF target is indeed expressed as carbon CO2 equivalents?
So when I read the last part of Claire's question, I think she refers to the fact that even within the LULUCF sector, you have some non-CO2 emissions that are very, very small inventory-wise, but there are other which are really linked to land use. So some nitrous oxide emissions, some methane emissions, but mainly the LULUCF scope is about the CO2 fluxes. And this is the scope that we consider for carbon farming, CO2 fluxes. Of course, some land use practices will also have some indirect impacts on nitrous oxide and methane. Think, for instance, of some type of crops which require less or more fertilizer application. These are to be taken into account when we look at the overall net carbon removals. So it's important to consider the overall greenhouse gas balance of each activity. But carbon farming is not supposed to certify emissions that are mainly aiming at reducing non-CO2 emissions, for instance, precision farming or manure management to reduce the methane emissions. So we're really talking about management practices that aim at increasing carbon sequestration or protecting carbon storage in soils. And all non-CO2 emissions that are an indirect effect of these activities are taken into account when we look at the net climate effects. I hope I made myself clear.
Okay, and just to follow on from that, from Marina.
Yeah, Marina.
So the question on, you know, the inclusion of LULUCF in the effort sharing regulation, and how do we ensure transparency and avoid double counting between official reporting and accounting system? So if you'd comment on that, please.
So an important objective will be to make the certification proposal consistent with inventories, national inventories, because especially with the soils, we are aware that there is a huge gap in between the lots of data and detailed information that the research projects like the ones we saw today are providing, and the very rough statistics and estimates that are used in inventory compilation. So we hope that certification of activities on the ground will create a consistent set of data that can then enrich and improve the quality of national inventories. Now, Marina refers to the issue of double counting. For the moment, we consider any incentive to carbon farming as a voluntary initiative. So if it's not only about offsetting, this I want to make clear, it's not only about balancing emissions with removals. It can also be a food company which wants to decrease emissions in its own value chain to just achieve some climate goals within the company. And this is a very direct way for the final food producer to require from its suppliers to reward within the suppliers climate-friendly practices. It's not about making any claims of climate neutrality. And even if it was so, these claims will be voluntary. And therefore they will not be double counted in the inventories. It's not, we are not at any rate, we are not linking carbon farming to the ETS, to the emission trading system. So we're not talking about a company which must pay for quotas of emissions, and instead of paying for these emission quotas, it buys the removals. This will be a problem of double counting, because then these offsets will be accounted for the company's accounts and also for the national accounts. But we are not considering this option. So it's really about voluntary applications of certificates, which can be for offsetting purposes, but also for other purposes. So we don't see a problem of double counting. If one day we will have a land sector ETS, one day in the future based on the certification framework, then we will have to ensure no double counting, of course.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. We'll give you a little break for a minute. And Nicola, there's a question coming in here on how do you see the eco schemes working in combination with carbon farming? It's again on the same theme in terms of the double counting part, to generate carbon credits from the same practices. How will that work from a CAP or an eco scheme perspective?
Yeah, thank you. This is indeed an important aspect to be considered. We are working in the preparation of the proposal for the certification on how to include consider not only funds coming from the common agricultural policy, but also from other public policies within this context. So we still don't have a clear reply on that, but I can, from my perspective, look a little bit broader. I would sometimes propose to look at it a little bit with a broader approach, with the fact that practices that are implemented at farm level can be beneficial for carbon, but also for other elements. So sometimes it will be a little bit difficult to see where really is the incentives only for carbon or also for production of food or for biodiversity and other ecosystem services sometimes. So that's it's a really complicated issue so far. There are also in analyzing member states strategic plan submitted. There are eco schemes that can have a good effect on soil organic carbon, for example, but there might not be a very straightforward link between the two. So that is one thing that we will have to analyze in terms of how to set the principle within the certification of carbon removals in order to ensure that that there is a good narrative behind it. Anyway, we believe that we need to find the synergies between funding coming from the private market and the public support, because in some cases only public support it could not be enough for having a very important uptake of carbon farming from at the holding level. Yeah, so that it's where we will have more focus on the synergies more than on the double funding issue between private and the public support. Of course, there might be a set of baseline regulatory requirements, and that can be sometimes at European level or at member state level, and that can also an element that could be considered when working on this part of the certification.
Okay, Nicola, considering the barriers for farmers, Sebastian has a question. In terms of joining carbon farming initiatives, can we understand that the European Commission mainly targets industrial solutions for carbon sequestration when it comes to the schemes expected in late 2022? And he says that he's not speaking of all policies, but do you have a comment for that?
Maybe that would also be a question for Valeria as well. But from my perspective, I see that there is a very important attention that the Commission is doing to remove us from the ecosystem, from the land sector. I mean, it really believes that it's a very important element for reaching the neutrality. But please, Valeria, if you have
No, I think maybe Sebastian means that it seems impossible to have certification methodologies ready for 2022 for carbon farming, whereas maybe it will be easier for industrial solutions where actually it's true that quantification is easier. If this is what is meant, we are completely aware that the different there is a wide range of carbon removal solutions, and they all have different strength and weaknesses. And when it comes to carbon farming, we have a big strength that it's a technology which is widely known, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to monitor and quantify, and it's mainly it's made up of many small farmers, which also creates a barrier. Whereas the industrial solutions are easier to quantify, but they're very expensive and at an early stage of development. So given this heterogeneity of solutions, it is indeed not expected that in 6 months we will have certification methodologies for all. We actually won't have certification methodologies for any. We will set out a framework to define these methodologies in the next years, together with the expert groups and together with the experts. So there will be probably also a sequence. So we will start with these solutions which are already well known, and we will prioritize those with the best ratio of mitigation potential and easiness or simplicity, low certification challenges, let's say. So yeah, just to manage expectations, there will not be 20 certification methodologies ready in 6 months. There will be a framework within which these certification methodologies will be developed.
Okay, thank you, Valeria. Leonard, there's a couple of questions here regarding the GRA and the Aim4C funding. What is the direct relevance with carbon farming, using the definition given by Valeria that is coming from Sarah?
Thanks. Yeah, that really depends on the specific activities that are carried out in the context of each of these initiatives. Both of them have a broader scope, of course, so they are not exclusively about carbon farming, but relevant activities are going on in both of these contexts. For instance, one of the innovation sprints that I mentioned in Aim for Climate, which I believe is led by Uruguay and involves also a number of other Latin American countries, is looking into methods for measuring carbon sequestration at farm level. So that's something that I think would be of interest also in the context of the policy developments that we are talking about. In the GRA, during the few months that I have been following it, there has not been perhaps anything directly relevant, but I do seem to remember that they had a conference at some point last year, which was dedicated to carbon farming. So it's worth checking the websites from these two programs if you want to find out more.
Okay, thank you, Leonard. One general question: what's the difference between Climate Farm demo and the network on carbon farming? Yeah,
that's a good question, and indeed it can be a bit bewildering, the variety of topics that we have in the different work programs over time and across the different parts of Horizon Europe. Climate Farm demo is, as I said, not quite up and running yet, but it has been, the project has been chosen. It's quite a large project, and it's really aiming to involve a significant number of farms directly in not only carbon farming, that should be stressed, but really a wide range of activities on mitigation as well as adaptation, but really bringing in, I think at the end of the day, 1,500 farms across all member states and all different pedoclimatic areas. So the work there is really focusing very much on what happens on the land, so to speak. Whereas the network as I mentioned, that's more of as the name already suggests, that's more of a networking and coordination kind of project, but it is more, it's much more directly focused than on carbon farming research.
Okay. We're going to move to the next session. There is some questions still in the question and answer that we'll endeavour to get answers for. Thank you very much to Valeria, Nicola and Leonard for a very informative session, and we hope that there has been a lot of enlightenment in terms of what DG Clima and DG Agri are, the policy that's coming forth, and also the funding. So thank you very much, and we'll now move